Karmic bond with a spirit haunts young woman. Summary. In a quiet town, 28-year-old Clara lives a life of solitude and dedication, balancing a demanding job and caring for her aging mother, Helen. Despite her success and beauty, love has eluded her, as if fate itself has intervened. One fateful night, while working late, Clara experiences a terrifying series of supernatural events, an eerie sound of footsteps, shadowy figures, and a near-fatal car accident. What begins as an ordinary evening spirals into a chilling encounter with forces unseen. Her mother's cryptic warnings about their family's past echo louder than ever. As Clara's reality blurs, she finds herself entwined with a spirit from a past life, a bond neither time nor death could sever. Faced with terror and an emotional reckoning, Clara must uncover the truth before the entity consumes her life. Part 1. A mother's concern. The fading light of the evening poured through the kitchen window, casting eerie shadows across the small dining room. The old clock on the wall ticked in the background, slow and deliberate, like the heartbeat of the house. Helen sat opposite her daughter, Clara, her gaze fixed on the thin lines of worry etched across her aging hands. The aroma of stew hung faintly in the air, though neither seemed eager to finish the meal. Clara, Helen finally said, her voice soft but firm, like the creaking of an old door. She hesitated for a moment, as if afraid of what she was about to say. You're 28 now, don't you think? It's time to think about marriage? About finding someone to share your life with. The words lingered in the still air, sinking into Clara's ears like stones. She stopped mid-bite, her fork hovering above the plate. Slowly, she placed it down with a deliberate clink. Mom, Clara said, exhaling as if trying to hold back a wave of frustration. She forced a smile, the kind meant to placate rather than reassure. We've had this conversation before. I'm fine. I have work, I have you. Isn't that enough? Helen's lips trembled slightly, her hands gripping the edge of the table as though it might steady her. Clara, I won't be here forever. A chill ran down Clara's spine. Her mother's words struck her like a cold wind against bare skin. She swallowed hard, her throat suddenly dry. Don't say that, Mom. You're fine. You're healthy. Why do you always talk like you're leaving? Helen's eyes softened, though sadness shimmered beneath the surface. Because it's true. Life doesn't wait, Clara. And I worry. I worry about what happens when I'm gone. You're strong, stronger than most, but strength doesn't mean you should be alone. Clara stiffened. She looked away, staring at the shadowy corners of the room where the dim light didn't quite reach. The loneliness her mother spoke of had always lurked there, like a ghost she pretended not to see. It crept in during quiet nights, whispering in her ears when she was too tired to ignore it. I'm not alone, Mom, she said finally, her voice tight. I have my job, my friends, and I have you. That's enough for me. Helen sighed, the sound barely audible. But it shouldn't be. Work isn't love, Clara. Friends come and go. I want you to have someone who sees you the way you deserve to be seen. Someone who will hold you when you're afraid, who will take care of you when stop. Clara's voice was sharper than she intended. The silence that followed was thick and heavy, pressing down on both of them. Helen's face crumpled into sadness, though she tried to mask it with a faint smile. I'm sorry, Clara. I just want you to be happy. Clara's heart twisted painfully at the look in her mother's eyes. For years, Helen had been both a parent and a friend, the person who had held everything together after Clara's father died. Clara knew her mother meant well, but every conversation like this left her feeling exposed, vulnerable, as though Helen could see through all the walls she had built. I am happy, Clara said, her voice softer now. She forced herself to meet Helen's gaze. I promise. Helen didn't respond. She only nodded, her expression filled with a sadness Clara couldn't quite name. Clara stood, gathering the plates to distract herself. As she turned her back to her mother, she allowed her smile to slip away. Her face, now hidden, was etched with weariness, a weariness she didn't dare let Helen see. From the sink, Clara glanced at the window. Outside, the last hints of daylight were fading. The trees loomed like dark sentinels, their branches clawing at the sky. A breeze swept through the yard, rattling the old fence and sending dead leaves scattering. For a moment, Clara thought she saw something move near the edge of the trees, a figure perhaps, standing still among the shadows. She blinked, and it was gone. Clara shook her head, letting out a shaky breath. "You're just tired," she told herself, turning the faucet on. The rush of water filled the room, drowning out the distant creaks and groans of the old house. Behind her, Helen sat quietly, her gaze distant. "You know," she said softly, more to herself than to Clara, "your father used to say we all have someone waiting for us. Somewhere. Sometimes it just takes longer to find them." Clara turned, her hands wet, the dish she held forgotten. "What do you mean?" Helen looked up, a faint, wistful smile on her lips. "Oh, it's nothing, dear. Just an old story." "I'm rambling again." Clara frowned but said nothing. She dried her hands, the room suddenly feeling colder, as though a draft had slipped through the cracks in the windows. The silence stretched again, but this time it was different. It was heavy, oppressive. It felt wrong. "I'm going to bed," Clara said quietly. "Good night, Mom." "Good night, sweetheart," Helen replied, though her voice sounded far away. Clara retreated to her room, shutting the door firmly behind her. She leaned against it for a moment, staring into the shadows that pooled across her floor. Outside, the wind howled, making the old windows rattle faintly. What did she mean about Dad? Clara wondered as she changed into her nightclothes. The thought lingered in her mind like a splinter, impossible to ignore. As she lay in bed, the quiet of the house settled over her like a blanket. But it wasn't comforting. The darkness outside her window seemed deeper than usual, pressing against the glass like a living thing. And somewhere, faintly, almost too faint to hear, came the sound of footsteps. Clara sat up, her heart pounding. She turned toward the window, holding her breath. Nothing. But the uneasy feeling didn't leave her. It lingered in the corners of the room, where the shadows lay thick. Where silence wasn't silence at all, but something waiting. She pulled the covers up to her chin, trying to shake off the unease. "You're just tired," she whispered to herself. But as she closed her eyes, she couldn't shake the thought that something or someone was watching her. And Helen, alone in her chair in the dim dining room, stared at the window as if she too could feel it. The weight of something unseen. Something that had been waiting for a very long time. Part 2. The late night shift. The clock on the office wall struck 11:30 p.m. The distant, hollow chime echoed faintly in the vast emptiness of the building. Clara sat hunched at her desk, the dull glow of the computer screen illuminating her tired face. Her eyes flicked toward the small clock in the corner of her monitor, then back to the endless spreadsheet that refused to make sense no matter how long she stared at it. "Just a few more minutes," she muttered, her voice scratchy from the hours of silence. The office, once bustling with her coworkers during the day, was now utterly still. The only sounds were the rhythmic tapping of her fingers on the keyboard and the low hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. Outside her window, the city was quiet, blanketed in darkness, as if the world itself had gone to sleep. Clara rubbed her eyes and leaned back in her chair with a groan. She glanced at her phone, a single missed call from her mother. "I'll call her when I'm done," she thought, feeling a small pang of guilt. Helen worried whenever Clara worked late. She always did. Pushing the thought aside, Clara forced herself back to the screen. The office felt colder than usual tonight, the chill nipping at her fingertips despite the warmth of her sweater. She grabbed her cardigan from the back of her chair and wrapped it tightly around her shoulders, but the discomfort persisted not just from the cold but from something else. Something harder to name. "Stop it," she scolded herself silently. "You're overthinking. You've been here 100 times before." But even as she tried to focus, her eyes kept straying toward the hallway outside her office door. The corridor stretched out like an endless tunnel, shrouded in shadows where the dim overhead lights flickered faintly. It was strange how, at night, even familiar places could take on a sinister air. Suddenly, Clara froze. A sound, soft, subtle, almost imperceptible. Footsteps. Her breath caught in her throat. She stayed perfectly still, her ears straining to pick up the noise again. Probably just the building settling, she thought, trying to steady her breathing. Or Maybe it's the janitor. But the sound came again. Closer this time. Tap, tap, tap. Clara turned toward the doorway, her heart hammering in her chest. The corridor beyond was empty, just shadows and the faint outline of desks and chairs farther down the hall. "Hello," she called, her voice breaking the stillness like a stone dropped into water. Silence. The hairs on the back of her neck stood on end. She swallowed hard, forcing herself to stand. Her legs felt unsteady as she stepped toward the door. She peered into the hallway, her eyes scanning the darkness for any sign of movement. "Is someone there?" she asked, her voice smaller now, almost pleading. Nothing. Clara exhaled shakily, pressing her hand to her chest to calm her racing heart. "You're imagining things," she told herself. "It's late, and you're tired. That's all." She turned back toward her desk, and froze again. There it was. A faint shadow, just at the edge of her vision. It moved, quick and silent, across the far end of the hallway. Clara spun around, her breath catching as her eyes darted frantically across the empty space. Nothing. Her pulse thundered in her ears, drowning out all other sounds. She wanted to turn the lights on, to banish the shadows that seemed to creep closer, but she didn't dare move. Her fingers curled tightly around the edge of the doorway. "Who's there?" she demanded, her voice louder now, shaking with fear. Still, there was no reply. The building groaned suddenly, the sound deep and resonant, as though the walls themselves were alive. Clara flinched, spinning around again. "This is ridiculous," she whispered under her breath. She stomped back to her desk, her movements more forceful than necessary, as though anger would mask her fear. She grabbed her bag, slung it over her shoulder, and turned off the computer. "I'm done. I'm leaving," she muttered to herself, as if the words would somehow protect her. The hallway stretched out ahead of her, darker now that the lights in her office were off. Clara walked briskly, her footsteps echoing far louder than they should have. She gripped her bag tightly, her fingers digging into the leather strap. Halfway down the hall, she heard it again. Tap, tap, tap. The footsteps sounded impossibly close now, as though someone were walking just behind her. Clara's breathing grew ragged. She turned her head slightly, glancing over her shoulder. No one. But something felt wrong, so wrong that the air itself felt heavier. She could feel it, even if she couldn't see it, something watching her. "Run," her mind whispered. "Run now." Clara broke into a sprint, her footsteps pounding against the tiled floor. She didn't dare look back, didn't dare stop until she reached the lobby. She shoved the door open and stumbled outside into the frigid night air. The sound of her own breathing filled her ears, wild and uneven. She stopped at her car, her hands shaking as she fumbled with her keys. Behind her, the office building loomed dark, quiet and different. Clara forced herself to glance back at the windows. For a moment, she thought she saw something, a figure standing there, watching her from the second floor. But when she blinked, it was gone. She climbed into her car and slammed the door shut, locking it instinctively. Her hands gripped the steering wheel, her knuckles white. The faint echo of footsteps still rang in her ears, even though she knew it was impossible. "Just my imagination," she whispered, staring at her reflection in the rearview mirror. "Just stress." That's all, but deep down, Clara knew something wasn't right. And as she drove home through the empty streets, she couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone, that something had followed her, unseen, into the night. Part 3. The parking garage encounter. The echo of Clara's footsteps rang sharply against the concrete walls of the parking garage. The sound was unnaturally loud in the otherwise hollow expanse. The dim, flickering fluorescent lights overhead gave the garage an eerie, abandoned feel, though it was technically still part of the office building. Her heels clicked steadily as she made her way to her car, the only vehicle left in the far corner of the garage, a stark silver against the darkness. Each step she took sent a spike of unease through her chest, a primal urge whispering that she wasn't supposed to be here. Not at this hour. "Just get to the car," she told herself firmly, clutching her bag to her chest. Her free hand reached into her coat pocket, closing around the cool metal of her car keys. The quiet was suffocating, broken only by the distant hum of the city outside and the faint dripping of water from somewhere in the shadows. The garage felt alive, as though the concrete pillars and dark corners had eyes of their own, watching her. Clara shivered, tightening her cardigan around herself. It's just the cold. Stop overthinking, she told herself. As she approached her car, her footsteps stopped, but the sound continued. Tap, tap, tap. Clara froze. Her breath hitched as her ears strained to confirm what her mind refused to believe. The sound of footsteps, distinct and deliberate, continued to echo faintly, coming from somewhere behind her. Slowly, as if moving too quickly might provoke something unseen, she turned her head to look over her shoulder. There was nothing there. The empty garage stretched out behind her, a maze of shadows and flickering lights. Yet the sound lingered fainter now, but still there. Tap, tap. Her chest tightened. She forced a shaky breath through her lips and turned back toward her car, quickening her pace. She hit the unlock button on her keys, the car's headlights flashing as the locks clicked open. The footsteps came again, closer. Clara broke into a near run, her heart pounding against her ribs like a drumbeat of terror. The cold air stung her face as she bolted toward her car, fumbling with the door handle. She yanked the door open, throwing herself inside and locking it in one frantic motion. The silence that followed was deafening. Clara sat still, her body trembling as she tried to catch her breath. Her hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white. She glanced in the rearview mirror, her breath fogging up the car window. Empty. The garage looked just as deserted as it had when she entered. The pillars were still, the shadows unmoving. She leaned her head back against the seat, squeezing her eyes shut for a moment. "You're imagining things," she whispered aloud, as if hearing her own voice would help ground her. "You're tired." That's all. Her fingers trembled as she reached for the ignition, turning the key. The engine roared to life, a small comfort against the pressing silence of the garage. The headlights flared on, cutting through the gloom, and for a brief moment she felt safe. Until she saw it. A shadow just at the edge of the headlights' reach flickered. Clara gasped, her eyes widening as she leaned closer to the windshield, trying to make sense of what she'd seen. The darkness beyond the light was thick, impenetrable. But she knew. Something was there. Her mind screamed at her to leave. Now. Clara threw the car into reverse, her movements frantic as she slammed her foot on the gas. The tires squealed against the concrete as she shot backward, jerking the wheel to spin the car around. Her headlights swept across the pillars and dark corners, illuminating nothing. And yet she swore she could feel it. Something. Watching. Waiting. With shaking hands, Clara shifted into drive, her foot pressing hard against the accelerator as she sped toward the exit ramp. The low ceiling of the garage rushed by in a blur, the lights streaking across her windshield like flashes of pale lightning. Her chest rose and fell with each shallow breath, panic sitting heavy on her shoulders. As she reached the ramp, the faint sound returned. Tap, tap, tap. Her blood ran cold. It was impossible. She was in the car alone. The sound couldn't be real. And yet it was there, reverberating through her ears, louder now, faster. She dared a glance in the rearview mirror. For a single, heart-stopping moment, Clara saw something, a dark figure, blurred and shadowed, standing at the far end of the garage. It didn't move, didn't pursue her, but it didn't have to. The stillness was worse than any chase. The figure or whatever was stood there, as if watching her leave. Her breath caught in her throat as she tore her gaze back to the road ahead, refusing to look again. She gripped the wheel with all her strength, navigating the sharp turn of the ramp as she emerged from the garage and into the empty city streets. The fresh night air hit her like a slap, but the sense of relief she expected didn't come. She kept driving, her eyes flicking between the road and the rearview mirror, as if expecting to see that figure again looming, impossible, chasing her down. But there was nothing. The streetlights blurred past her as she sped home, unable to shake the feeling that something had followed her, that it was still there, somewhere in the dark. By the time she pulled into her driveway, her body felt drained, every muscle aching from tension. She sat in the car for a long moment, staring blankly at the quiet house. The lights in the living room were on. Helen must still be awake. Clara's hands trembled as she turned off the ignition. She lingered for a moment, staring at her reflection in the darkened window. Her face was pale, her eyes wide and haunted. She looked as though she'd seen a ghost, and maybe she had. Finally, with a deep breath, she climbed out of the car. The cool night air wrapped around her, but she barely felt it. She hurried up the steps and unlocked the front door, stepping inside and bolting it behind her. The house was warm, safe, but even here, the unease followed her like a shadow. Helen's voice called from the kitchen, soft and familiar. "Clara? Is that you?" Clara swallowed, forcing her voice not to tremble. "Yeah, Mom. It's me." As she stepped into the kitchen and saw her mother's kind face, some of the tension finally began to lift. Helen frowned, noticing her daughter's pallor. "You're home late again," Helen said gently. "Are you all right?" Clara hesitated, her fingers brushing against the strap of her bag. She wanted to tell her about the footsteps, the shadow, the feeling of being watched. But the words wouldn't come. How could she explain something that didn't make sense, even to her? Instead, she forced a small smile. "I'm fine, Mom. Just tired." Helen studied her for a moment but said nothing. Clara turned toward the hallway, her voice faint. "I'm going to bed." As she climbed the stairs to her room, the shadows in the house seemed darker than usual, lingering in the corners where the light didn't reach. And as Clara lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, she couldn't stop hearing it. Tap, 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 even though she knew there was no one there. Part 4. The Roadside Apparition. Clara gripped the steering wheel with clammy hands, the soft hum of her car engine the only sound breaking the heavy silence. The night outside was unnaturally quiet, the streets empty as though the city had fallen into an uneasy sleep. She rolled down the window just slightly, hoping the rush of the cold night air might steady her nerves. Her heart still raced from what had happened in the parking garage. She kept replaying the moment over and over and over in her head, the sound of footsteps, the dark figure watching from afar. It had felt too real to dismiss as a trick of her imagination. And yet what could it have been? Clara shook her head, scolding herself silently. "You're just tired, that's all." Her headlights cut through the darkness as she turned onto the long, empty road leading home. It was a stretch of old highway surrounded by fields and trees, winding like a black ribbon through the silent night. The only lights came from her car, casting narrow beams that stretched far ahead before disappearing into the black void. The sense of unease hadn't left her. It clung to her like a damp fog, heavier with every mile. Clara turned up the radio to distract herself, but the familiar hum of music did little to quiet the gnawing feeling in her gut that she wasn't alone. The air inside the car felt colder now, as if something unseen had crept in and was sitting silently beside her. Clara glanced into the rearview mirror out of instinct, just a quick look. Nothing. She let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. But as she turned her gaze back to the road, her body went rigid. There, just ahead, in the middle of the road, stood a figure. Clara's heart stopped. She slammed her foot on the brake, tires screeching as the car jolted violently to a halt. Her body lurched forward against the seatbelt, the sharp strain bringing tears to her eyes. The headlights bathed the figure in a pale, flickering glow. Clara's breath came in short, ragged gasps as she stared through the windshield, trying to process what she was seeing. It was a man, or at least it looked like one. Tall and unmoving, his silhouette was dark against the headlights. His face, however, was obscured by shadow. He wore what looked like an old, tattered coat, the edges frayed as if it had been left to rot. He didn't move, didn't react to the car bearing down on him. Clara's pulse pounded in her ears. She gripped the steering wheel tighter, her knuckles pale white against the leather. What she whispered, unable to form a coherent thought. Her mind screamed at her to do something, to move, to drive around him, but her body refused to obey. She sat frozen, locked in a silent stare down with the figure. Then, without warning, he vanished. Clara blinked, her breath catching painfully in her throat. One moment he was there, solid and unmistakable. The next he was gone, as though he'd never existed. The road ahead lay empty, her headlights illuminating nothing but cracked asphalt and endless darkness. Her body trembled violently as she let out a shaky gasp. What the hell? She scanned the road frantically, her eyes darting to the mirrors, the fields, the trees lining the highway. There was no sign of him, no movement, no sound. Clara's hands shook as she gripped the wheel, her pulse a frantic drumbeat in her chest. It's not real. I didn't see that she forced herself to breathe, each inhale jagged and shallow. It was just stress. A trick of the light. The words came out as little more than whispers, an attempt to rationalize the impossible. But deep down, Clara knew what she'd seen. That figure. That thing had been there. She forced herself to move, shifting the car back into drive with trembling fingers. The vehicle rolled forward, slower this time, as if the road itself might betray her. She kept her eyes locked on the path ahead, afraid to look anywhere else. A strange sensation prickled at the back of her neck, like the brush of unseen fingertips. She gritted her teeth, her body rigid, as she pressed the gas pedal slightly harder. The car picked up speed, but the feeling didn't fade. Her gaze flickered to the rearview mirror again, just a glance. And there he was, the figure, sitting in her back seat. Clara's scream ripped through the air as she jerked the wheel, the car swerving violently across the road. Her heart felt like it might burst from her chest as she turned to look, but there was nothing there. The back seat was empty. The car skidded to a stop on the shoulder of the road, the engine sputtering as the vehicle idled unevenly. Clara clutched the wheel, gasping for breath, her entire body shaking. Tears blurred her vision as she looked behind her again, desperate for proof that she was alone. Empty. Her hands flew to her face, pressing against her mouth, as if to silence her sobs. She couldn't explain any of it. She'd seen him. She knew she had. Minutes passed before she found the courage to start driving again. Her hands trembled on the wheel, every nerve in her body screaming that she had to get home, had to get somewhere safe. The road stretched endlessly ahead, black and empty, but she didn't stop. The headlights illuminated the path forward, but every shadow now felt alive, every flicker at the edge of her vision a threat. Clara kept glancing at the mirrors, expecting to see that figure again, waiting for him to appear. He didn't. By the time she reached her house, the eastern sky was beginning to lighten with the first hints of dawn. She stumbled out of the car, her legs barely supporting her, and rushed to the front door. Her fingers fumbled with the key as she unlocked it, bolting the door shut behind her. The house was still and quiet, safe. Clara sank onto the floor of the entryway, her back against the door as she buried her face in her hands. The events of the night replayed over and over in her mind, each image sharper than the last, the figure on the road, the impossible sensation of him sitting behind her. What is happening to me? She whispered to herself, her voice breaking. From the kitchen, Helen called softly, her voice groggy with sleep. Clara? Is everything all right? Clara wiped her face and swallowed hard, forcing her voice to steady. Yeah, Mom, I'm fine. I just got home late. Go back to sleep. Helen's voice faded, leaving Clara alone in the stillness of the house. She didn't move for a long time, her back pressed against the door, her gaze fixed on the darkened hallway ahead. Outside, the wind stirred the trees, but Clara could have sworn she heard something else. A faint tapping sound against the window. Tap. 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 Part 5. An ominous return. Clara's trembling fingers fumbled with the lock as she pushed the front door open. The house felt unnaturally quiet, almost as though it had been holding its breath, waiting for her return. The familiar scent of Helen's lavender-scented candles lingered faintly in the air, but it did nothing to calm Clara's racing heart. She closed the door behind her, bolting it with a shaky hand. Her legs felt weak as she leaned her back against the wood, letting her breath come in ragged gasps. Every nerve in her body still buzzed with tension. Her mind was a blur of headlights, shadows, and that figure on the road, and then in her backseat. It wasn't real, she whispered to herself. though even the sound of her own voice sent a chill down her spine. The faint creak of floorboards above broke the silence. Clara's head snapped up. "Helen." "Clara? Is that you?" Her mother's voice floated faintly down the staircase, thick with sleep. Clara swallowed the lump in her throat and forced herself to answer, though her voice sounded small and hoarse. "Yeah, Mom. It's me. Go back to sleep." There was a pause before Helen replied, her tone laced with concern. "Are you all right, sweetheart? You're home so late." "I'm fine," Clara lied quickly, though the words caught in her throat. "Just a long night. I'll see you in the morning." She didn't wait for a response. Peeling herself away from the door, Clara dropped her bag carelessly onto the floor and headed toward the living room. The familiar creaks of the old wooden house followed her with each step, the sound unsettling in the eerie stillness. She clicked on the lamp by the couch, casting a small pool of golden light onto the room. For a fleeting moment, Clara allowed herself to exhale. Safe. I'm safe. But that comfort didn't last. Clara froze mid-step as her eyes fell on a figure sprawled on the armchair near the window. Her breath caught in her throat before her mind registered who it was. Helen. Her mother sat with her head lulled back slightly. Her body slumped as though she'd fallen asleep waiting for Clara to come home. The soft rise and fall of her chest was the only sign that she was okay. Clara let out a shaky breath, relief flooding her veins. She moved closer, kneeling in front of her mother. "Mom," Clara whispered, gently resting her hand on Helen's knee. Helen stirred slightly, groaning faintly as her head lifted. Her eyelids fluttered open, bleary with sleep as she looked at Clara. "Sweetheart," Helen murmured, her voice hoarse. "What time is it?" Late, Clara replied, her voice quieter now. "I'm sorry. You shouldn't have waited up." Helen blinked, her expression slowly sharpening as she took in Clara's disheveled state. The pale face, the hollow eyes, the trembling hands. Helen's voice dropped, soft but edged with alarm. "What happened?" "Nothing," Clara said too quickly, shaking her head. I worked late, that's all. I'm fine, Mom. Really?" But Helen's eyes narrowed, as though she could see right through her daughter's carefully crafted lie. She reached out, her cold fingers brushing lightly against Clara's cheek. And then she froze. "Clara," Helen said sharply, sitting up straighter. "What's that on your face?" Clara blinked. "What?" Helen leaned in closer, squinting in the dim light. Her fingertips traced the edge of Clara's cheek, where something dark smudged against her otherwise pale skin. Clara frowned, her heart skipping a beat as she grabbed her mother's hand and stood up. "It's nothing," Clara stammered, brushing at her cheek with the sleeve of her sweater. Her fingers came away stained with something dark, like soot or ash. Her pulse quickened. Helen's face went pale as she stared at Clara's hand. "Sweetheart, where did that come from?" Clara's mind raced. Soot? Ash? It didn't make sense. She hadn't been near a fire. There was no logical explanation. And yet, as she stared at the mark on her hand, a sickening feeling churned in her stomach. "Maybe it's from work," Clara said weakly, though even she didn't believe it. Helen shook her head slowly, her gaze unblinking. "Clara, what happened tonight?" Clara looked away, trying to suppress the rising dread that tightened her chest. She couldn't tell her mother. How could she explain the figure on the road? The thing in her backseat? The way she felt as though something unseen had followed her home. "Nothing happened," Clara said again, her voice trembling. She turned toward the hallway, desperate to escape Helen's penetrating gaze. "I'm going to bed." "You should get some rest too." Helen didn't answer, but Clara felt her mother's eyes on her as she moved stiffly up the stairs. Her legs felt like lead, every step an effort. The hallway to her room felt longer than usual, the shadows pooling in the corners deeper than they had ever been before. When she finally reached her bedroom, Clara shut the door firmly behind her, locking it out of instinct. She let out a shuddering breath and leaned back against the door, staring into the room. It was dark, too dark. The faint beam of light from the hallway barely reached the floor beneath the door. For a long moment, Clara didn't move. She could hear her heartbeat pounding in her ears, her breathing uneven. Her gaze flicked to the mirror above her dresser. She could just make out her reflection in the dim light, and the smudge on her cheek. Slowly, she moved toward it. Her hand trembled as she reached up, touching the mark again. It felt dry, gritty against her skin, and something about it made her stomach turn. She stared into the mirror, into her own tired eyes. Then, just behind her reflection, she saw it. A shadow. Clara spun around, her breath catching in her throat. The room was empty, but the feeling remained. The sense that something was watching her, hiding just beyond what she could see. Her chest tightened as she backed toward the bed, every muscle in her body tense. She crawled under the covers, pulling them up to her chin like a child hiding from a nightmare. But the smudge remained on her skin. And outside her window, the wind howled, rattling the glass. For just a moment, she thought she heard it again. That faint tapping sound. Tap, tap, tap. Part 6. Whispers in the dark. Clara tossed and turned in bed, the sheets damp with sweat despite the icy chill in the room. The house was silent, save for the occasional creak of old wood settling or the distant whistle of the wind outside. Yet, in the quiet, a suffocating unease pressed down on her chest like a leaden weight. She kept her eyes tightly shut, forcing herself to ignore the gnawing sensation at the back of her mind that something wasn't right. The smudge of ash on her cheek earlier still lingered in her thoughts, as though it had marked her in some way, something she couldn't quite explain. It's just stress, she repeated over and over like a mantra. It's just stress. Finally, exhaustion won. Clara drifted into a restless sleep, though it offered no respite. Instead, the dream came. It began in silence, a thick, soupy fog that clung to everything. Clara stood alone in an endless expanse of gray mist, her bare feet sinking into soft, wet earth. The air was cold, damp, and heavy, as though it had been trapped for centuries. She looked around, her breath visible in the freezing air, but there was nothing, only the mist stretching into infinity. Then, faintly, she heard it. A voice, low, distant, and murmuring, the words indistinguishable at first. It seemed to come from everywhere, nowhere at once, like the very fog was speaking. Clara turned slowly, trying to find the source, but the mist thickened with every step she took. Her chest tightened, panic clawing its way through her ribs. Hello, she called, but the sound of her voice felt swallowed by the void. The whispering grew louder. You promised me, Clara froze. The voice was no longer distant, it was right behind her. Slowly, painfully, she turned her head. Her breath caught in her throat. Standing there just beyond the veil of mist was a figure. Tall, gaunt, and cloaked in a shroud of gray, its face was obscured, nothing but a void where features should have been. Her pulse thundered in her ears as the figure stepped closer. Its movement smooth and unnatural, like a puppet on invisible strings. The mist seemed to ripple around it, pulling toward the figure as though it hungered for something. Who are you, Clara choked, her voice cracking with terror. The figure didn't respond. Instead, it raised one skeletal hand, fingers outstretched, pointing directly at her. You promised me, it said again, a voice like dead leaves rustling, dry and hollow, yet filled with quiet rage. The words echoed in her skull, burrowing deep like shards of glass. Clara staggered back, her feet slipping in the soft earth. I don't know you, she screamed. I didn't promise anything. The figure stepped closer. You promised me. And you left me. The air around her grew colder, biting into her skin. Clara turned to run, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst. The mist swirled violently around her as she stumbled forward, desperate to escape. But no matter how far she ran, the figure's voice followed her. You promised me. It was inside her head now, reverberating over and over like a cruel chant. The ground beneath her seemed to crumble, pulling her feet deeper into the earth as she fought to move. Her limbs felt like lead, her screams muffled by the thick, smothering fog. And then, the hand. Cold, bony fingers wrapped around her wrist, yanking her backward with a force that stole the air from her lungs. Clara fell hard, her body hitting the ground as the fog curled around her like claws. The figure loomed over her now, close enough that she could feel the icy nothingness radiating from its body. Its faceless void stared down at her, unrelenting. "You cannot escape," it hissed, its voice splintering into a chorus of whispers. "You will remember." The skeletal hand gripped her face, and for a split second, Clara felt it, a flood of something crashing through her mind. Grief, anger, betrayal, a memory that wasn't hers. Flashes of dark, crumbling places, echoes of sobbing, the faint outline of another face she couldn't recognize. And through it all, that same voice. "You promised me," Clara screamed. She jolted awake, the sound still tearing from her throat. Her body was drenched in sweat, her sheets tangled around her legs as though she'd been fighting something in her sleep. Her chest heaved as she gasped for air, her pulse a chaotic drumbeat in her ears. The room was dark, the faintest sliver of moonlight spilling through the window. But even in the stillness, Clara felt it, a cold presence lingering at the edge of her awareness. Her trembling hands flew to her face, her skin clammy and slick. She expected nothing, but as her fingers brushed her cheek, her stomach dropped. The smudge, that same dark, gritty mark was there, as though the figure's icy hand had left it behind. Clara stared at her reflection in the mirror across the room. Her face was pale, her hair disheveled, and the faint stain of ash stood out like a bruise. Tears pricked at her eyes as she whispered to herself, "It was just a dream. Just a dream." But even as she said it, she knew. She felt it. The dream wasn't just a dream. And outside the window, a shadow moved. A faint, rhythmic sound reached her ears. Tap, tap. Clara flinched, yanking the covers up to her chin as she stared at the window. The wind howled again, rattling the glass as if something outside was demanding to be let in. "You promised me," the voice whispered faintly in the back of her mind, as though the dream had followed her into the waking world. Clara curled into herself, her entire body trembling as the tears spilled down her cheeks. She wanted to scream again, to cry for her mother, but she couldn't make a sound. The fear was too great, too real, and deep down, a horrible truth began to settle in her chest, a truth she couldn't yet bring herself to accept. The figure in the mist wasn't done with her, and whatever it wanted, it wasn't going to stop. Part 7. A Cryptic Revelation. The morning sun streamed weakly through the windows, its warmth doing little to chase away the chill lingering in the house. Clara sat at the kitchen table, her hands wrapped tightly around a steaming mug of coffee. The dark circles under her eyes betrayed the restless, terrifying night she'd endured. Every sip tasted bitter, but she barely noticed. Her thoughts raced, looping through the dream and the faceless figure's accusation. "You promised me." The memory of the voice made her shiver. It wasn't just a nightmare, it felt real. Too real. Clara Helen's gentle voice startled her. Clara looked up to see her mother standing in the doorway, still in her robe. Helen's face was etched with worry as she studied her daughter, pale, trembling, and hollow-eyed. "You look like you've seen a ghost," Helen said softly, moving to sit across from her. "Did you sleep at all?" Clara's fingers tightened around the mug. For a moment she didn't respond, staring instead into the dark liquid as if it held answers. Finally she whispered, "Mom, something's wrong." Helen's brow furrowed, her expression turning serious. "What happened?" Clara took a deep breath, steadying herself. "I've been hearing things, seeing things. It started a couple of days ago, noises, shadows. Then last night," she trailed off, her throat tightening. Helen reached out, placing her warm, steady hand over Clara's trembling one. "Go on, sweetheart." "I'm listening. I had a dream," Clara said shakily, her voice barely above a whisper. Or maybe it wasn't a dream. There was this figure, tall, cloaked in mist. I couldn't see its face, but it spoke to me. It said," she hesitated, the words catching in her throat. "It said, 'You promised me.'" Helen's face paled instantly, her fingers jerking back as though burned. "Clara, what did you just say?" Clara stared at her mother, surprised by the reaction. "It said I promised something." "I don't understand." Helen pushed back from the table, standing abruptly. Her hands trembled as she pressed them to her chest, pacing slowly across the kitchen floor. "Mom," Clara said, a rising note of panic in her voice. "What is it? Do you know something?" Helen stopped, her back to Clara. She stood there for a long moment, her shoulders rising and falling with heavy breaths. Finally, Helen turned around, her face stricken with an emotion Clara couldn't place: fear, grief, guilt. There's something I never told you, Clara. Something about you. And about our family." Clara blinked, her mind struggling to process her mother's words. "What are you talking about?" Helen hesitated, tears welling in her eyes as she sat back down, reaching for Clara's hand again. Her voice trembled as she spoke. "When you were born, I went to see a woman. A seer, or maybe a medium. Your father had just passed and I was desperate. I wanted to know if he was still watching over us." Clara stared at her mother, stunned. Helen had never spoken about this before. "What did she say?" Helen's voice dropped to a whisper. "She said you were special, that your soul wasn't alone, that it had been tied to another, to someone from a past life, someone who wouldn't let go." Clara felt the air leave her lungs, the mug slipping slightly in her grip. "A past life?" Helen nodded, wiping at her tears with trembling hands. I didn't want to believe her. I thought it was nonsense. But she said this bond, it wasn't a good one. It was dangerous. Something unfinished. And if it ever returned, it would try to reclaim you. Clara's heart thudded painfully in her chest. "Reclaim me? What does that even mean?" Helen shook her head, her voice breaking. "I don't know. I didn't ask. I was so scared, Clara. I thought she was trying to scare me into paying more money, so I never went back. But now..." Helen looked at her daughter, her eyes wide and haunted. "Now, I wonder if she was right." Clara sat in stunned silence, her mind reeling. The smudges on her face. The figure in the dream. The words, "You promised me." "This can't be real," Clara whispered, shaking her head violently. "You're saying there's a spirit, a ghost following me because of something I did in a past life?" Helen's voice was quiet but firm. "Not because of what you did. Because of what you left unfinished. It's not your fault, Clara. It's just fate." "No," Clara snapped, standing suddenly. The chair scraped loudly against the floor. Her hands clenched into fists as she paced the small kitchen. "That doesn't make sense. This is insane." Helen watched her daughter helplessly, tears slipping down her face. "Clara, listen to me. I know how it sounds, but you can't ignore this. If it's back, if it's reaching out to you, it means it wants something. And it won't stop until it gets it." Clara stopped pacing, her heart hammering. Helen's words hung heavy in the air, a weight she couldn't shake. It won't stop. Her thoughts flashed to the dream, the icy grip of the figure's hand, the rage in its voice. It had felt so real. And now Helen's revelation was like a key turning in a lock, opening a door Clara didn't want to look through. "What do I do?" Clara whispered finally, her voice cracking. Helen stood and pulled her daughter into a tight embrace, holding her as though she might vanish at any moment. "I don't know," she admitted. "But we'll figure it out together. I promise." Clara clung to her mother, tears spilling down her cheeks as the fear threatened to swallow her whole. Outside, the wind picked up, whistling faintly through the cracks in the window frames. It sounded almost like a voice, low and cruel, whispering through the walls. "You promised me." Clara squeezed her eyes shut, trying to block it out. But deep down, she knew the truth. It had begun. And whatever was coming for her, it wouldn't stop. Part 8. The promise of the past. The sun had barely begun its slow ascent when Clara found herself pacing the length of the living room, her nerves frayed to their very edges. The previous night, the dream, the voice, her mother's revelation clawed at her thoughts with relentless intensity. The air in the house felt heavy, as though it carried the weight of an unseen presence. Helen sat quietly in her armchair, her eyes following Clara's frantic movements. In the dim morning light, Helen looked older, smaller somehow. Her hands trembled faintly as she held them in her lap, but she said nothing, waiting for Clara to speak first. Finally, Clara stopped, spinning toward her mother. "How long have you known?" she demanded, her voice trembling with both fear and anger. "How long have you known something was wrong with me?" Helen flinched at her daughter's tone, but she didn't look away. "I didn't know for certain," she said softly. "I hoped it was nothing, just the ramblings of a stranger. But after your father passed and the seer spoke about your soul, I could never shake the feeling that something was watching you." Watching me, Clara's voice rose slightly, disbelief mingling with terror. "Mom, you're saying this thing, whatever it is, has been with me my whole life. And you never thought to tell me?" Helen's face crumpled, guilt etched into every line. "What was I supposed to say, Clara? That you were being haunted by something from a past life? How could I tell you that when I didn't understand it myself?" Clara sank onto the couch, burying her face in her hands. She felt as though the ground had been ripped out from beneath her, leaving her tumbling into an endless void. "It doesn't make sense," she whispered, her voice muffled. "How can something like this even exist? A past life? A bond? None of this should be real." Helen stood and moved to sit beside her daughter. She placed a trembling hand on Clara's shoulder, squeezing gently. "Sometimes the past doesn't stay buried, sweetheart. Some souls hold on. If a promise was made, if something was left unfinished, it can follow us, even through death." Clara lifted her head, her tear-streaked face a mix of anger and confusion. "But what did I promise? How could I promise anything if I didn't exist yet?" Helen's gaze grew distant. "Your soul existed. You may not remember, but whatever this bond is, it goes back beyond this life, beyond this time." Clara stared at her mother, horror curling in her gut. "So you're saying I'm being haunted by my own mistakes? By something I did before I was even me?" Helen nodded slowly, her voice barely a whisper. "I think so." Clara stood abruptly, her chest tight with panic. The room seemed smaller now, the walls pressing in on her. "No, that's insane. This can't be happening." She turned to face her mother, her eyes wild. "Mom, what does it want from me? How do I make it stop?" Helen hesitated. "I don't know. But you need to understand. Whatever it is, it's tied to you. And it's angry." The words sent a chill through Clara, deep and bone shaking. She wrapped her arms around herself, as though that might protect her from the truth. She could still hear the voice "you promised me" repeating over and over in her head, like a broken record. Suddenly, a memory flickered in her mind. It wasn't hers, yet it felt familiar. A flash of darkness, a silhouette standing by a window, whispering something she couldn't quite hear. Then a feeling, deep sorrow, loss, and betrayal. Clara gasped, clutching at her temples as the memory sent a sharp pain through her skull. Helen was on her feet now, moving toward her. "I saw something," Clara said through gritted teeth. "It's like a memory, but it's not mine. It's not mine, Mom." Helen reached for her daughter, trying to steady her. "What did you see?" Clara shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "It was so sad and angry, like I betrayed someone. But I don't know who. I don't know what I'm supposed to do." Helen's face grew even paler. "It's trying to show you, Clara. It's trying to make you remember." Clara pulled away, staggering backward. "I don't want to remember. I didn't ask for this." But even as the words left her mouth, she knew it was too late. The figure, the whispers, the dreams, they weren't going to stop. The past was clawing its way back to her, demanding to be acknowledged, demanding to be fulfilled. The low whistle of the wind outside grew louder, rattling the windows as though something wanted in. Clara turned toward the sound, her eyes wide with fear. "It won't let me go, will it?" she whispered. Helen's voice was soft but firm. "No, Clara, not until you make it right." Clara sank to her knees, the weight of the truth crashing down on her. Fear and desperation coiled tightly around her heart. What did I promise? And in the silence of the house, as the wind howled outside, the answer seemed to whisper just beyond her reach. "You promised me." Part 9. The Unseen Fate. The hours slipped by like sand through an hourglass, each one slower and heavier than the last. Clara sat curled up on the couch, knees hugged tightly to her chest, staring blankly at the window. Outside, the late afternoon light was beginning to fade, spilling orange and gold across the horizon, a beauty she couldn't see, couldn't feel. Her thoughts were consumed by a truth she could no longer deny. She wasn't alone. Somewhere, out there, or perhaps within herself, a shadow followed her, relentless and unseen. Its voice echoed in her mind, "You promised me." Every time she blinked, she saw flashes of that dream, the faceless figure emerging from the mist, its bony hand pulling her into darkness. Helen, sitting quietly nearby, watched her daughter with worried eyes. The silence between them was heavy, punctuated only by the creak of the old house and the faint ticking of the clock on the wall. Helen's frail fingers toyed with the edge of her sweater as she spoke softly. "Clara," she said, breaking the silence, "you can't keep ignoring this. Whatever it is, it's not going to stop." Clara didn't respond. Her eyes stayed fixed on the darkening sky, her mind a whirl of fragmented memories and unanswered questions. Helen tried again. "Sweetheart, you have to face it. Maybe it's trying to tell you something. Maybe it wants you to remember." Clara's voice was barely a whisper, but the raw edge in it made Helen flinch. "What if I don't want to remember?" She turned her head, her tear-filled eyes meeting her mother's. "What if remembering means it takes me? What if it destroys me?" Helen hesitated, her own fear surfacing. But she pushed it down. "If you don't face it, Clara, it will still destroy you piece by piece." "Fear is what gives it power," Clara bit her lip, her hands trembling as they clutched the blanket around her shoulders. "How do I face something I don't even understand?" Before Helen could answer, a sudden bang rattled the windows. Clara jumped, her heart leaping into her throat as the sound reverberated through the house. She spun toward the window, but the darkness outside was impenetrable. The wind picked up again, its howl twisting into something more, a low, mournful wail that rose and fell like a dirge. Helen's face went pale. "It's here." Clara's body stiffened. The hair on her arms prickled as she turned slowly toward the center of the room. The air had changed. It was colder now, so cold that her breath fogged faintly in front of her lips. The house creaked, as though shifting under an invisible weight. Tap. Tap. The sound of footsteps echoed faintly, though it was impossible to tell where they were coming from. Upstairs? Down the hall? Or just behind the door? Clara rose to her feet, the blanket sliding off her shoulders and pooling at her feet. "Mom," she whispered, her voice shaking. Helen stood as well, her frail frame trembling. "Clara, don't turn away from it this time. If it's calling for you, you need to face it. Ask it what it wants." Clara turned to her mother, incredulous. "How can you say that? You want me to talk to it? To the thing that's been following me? You've seen what it does." "It doesn't matter," Helen said, her voice firm despite her fear. "Running won't save you. It's already inside, Clara." "Inside you?" Clara staggered back, the truth of her mother's words hitting her like a punch to the chest. "No," she whispered, shaking her head violently. "No, I can't do this." The temperature dropped further, the cold so intense now that it felt like knives piercing her skin. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to stretch and twist, curling along the walls like dark fingers reaching for her. And then she heard it. "You promised me." The voice was everywhere, in the walls, the ceiling, the floorboards beneath her feet, deep, hollow, and filled with anguish. Clara clapped her hands over her ears, tears spilling down her cheeks as she screamed, "Stop. Leave me alone." But the voice only grew louder, insistent. "You promised me, and you left me." Suddenly, the world tilted and Clara fell to her knees. The floor beneath her seemed to ripple like water, and flashes of that terrible dream, the faceless figure, the cold mist, the skeletal hand flooded her mind. Her mother's voice broke through the haze, faint and desperate. "Clara, listen to it. What did you promise?" Through the haze of fear and pain, Clara's vision began to blur. In her mind's eye, memories that weren't hers flickered like flames. A darkened room, a broken vow, two figures, one pleading, the other turning away. She heard a voice, her own voice, though different, older, and tinged with sorrow. "I will come back. I swear it. You have my promise." The realization hit Clara like a tidal wave. the breath torn from her lungs. "I promised," she choked, tears streaming down her face. "I promised to come back." And I didn't. The shadows swelled around her, the voice now a roar in her ears. "You left me. You broke your promise." I didn't know, Clara sobbed, her voice breaking. "I didn't remember. I'm sorry. I didn't know." The darkness seemed to hesitate, as though considering her words. The air grew heavier still, pressing against Clara like an invisible hand, suffocating her. "What do you want from me?" she whispered desperately. The voice lowered, its rage softening into something far worse, despair. "Remember me. Finish what you began." Clara collapsed forward, her forehead pressing against the cold wooden floor. Her breathing slowed as the shadows receded, curling back into the corners of the room. The cold began to fade, replaced by a hollow silence. Helen rushed to her daughter's side, pulling her into her arms. Clara clung to her mother, her body shaking uncontrollably. "It's not over," Clara whispered, her voice broken and raw. "I have to remember. I have to find it. I can't run anymore." Helen stroked her daughter's hair, tears running silently down her cheeks. "We'll figure this out together. You're not alone." But as Clara closed her eyes, exhaustion overtaking her, she knew the truth. This wasn't over. The past had found her, and it would not let her go until she kept the promise that bound her. A promise sealed by love. A promise betrayed by death. And a fate that time itself could not erase.